really all we know about Tony is his photographs. I first met him a few years before he died, and he was known to the Conway Library at the Courtauld as a very, very expert photographer of British architecture, British buildings, and he was an occasional visitor to the Conways, so that he would come here and would occasionally give us one of his pictures. And so it was a great surprise when he died that, although it was already understood that his collection would come here to the Courtauld on his death, and that's around about 160,000 images, it was a great surprise to us that it contained images that went way beyond the areas in which we kind of assumed that he worked.
He's not particularly well known, which is quite surprising, given the huge quantity of work and the quality of his work.
I think the most interesting are the images of Syria, of Kurdistan, of Iraq, other images of Egypt. And these, I think, are of special interest because they were taken in the 1940s.
His work that he did in the Middle East, there's much more work that looks at people and urban life in general. As far as I've seen looking through his archives, I've not found that human angle elsewhere in his photographs.
I can think of one photograph of the market square at Bury St Edmunds, in which he's cleared every single car from the square, and the only car that remains in the square is his own car, and it's sitting right in the centre. And I think he's somebody who didn't like a human element in any of his photographs. So I think it's quite curious that the photographs from the Middle East are very, they have a strong sense of compassion and a strong sense of wishing to explore the lives of the people that he photographed, and that then disappears. Well, we know very little. I mean, we know that Tony worked for the RAF during the war as a photographer, but most of these images are taken in the last years of the war, from 1942, and they were taken in subsequent years. I think the greatest mystery is why he kept returning to these areas, because, for example, to Syria, he returned 3 or 4 times. I think the last time he went to Syria was in the 1980s.
We do know is that many of Kersting's prints held at the Courtauld do have a Crown copyright stamp, so it's quite possible that some of his work was undertaken as a personal project, and some was undertaken as a photographer who was gathering information for the government, whichever department it was.
It's tempting to think that perhaps there was other work that he might have been doing for the British government at the time, and that this occasional appearance of a photograph on government paper represents 2 collections that occasionally got muddled or mixed over. Or maybe, I talked to him about this during his lifetime, and he said, that he just had paper left over from the war.
Yes, it is a mystery how Kersting was able to fund all this work. At that time, photography was a very expensive undertaking, and Kersting produced thousands of negatives, glass plate photographs, and did a lot of printing. He had transport, he had logistical support to travel quite extensively in the Middle East during a time where it wouldn't really have been possible to do so in a region which was a major battleground during the Second World War.
He would have needed a driver, a translator. We can do several little exercises in looking at his collection and see that perhaps in one day he shot more glass plate negatives than it's possible for somebody to carry on their own. So he must have had help. question that really needs to be answered, the two questions really, is that how he managed to pay for this level of travelling, in the absence of making a huge income from photography. I mean, he was relatively wealthy, but not perhaps enough to pay for travel at this frequency and level of intensity. I think that's a real question as to how Tony managed to do that, and whether there was a third party involved. And I think the assumption is that that was perhaps a government body. I don't know. I asked Tony once in his lifetime, and he just sort of said that he liked going on holiday. But it seems that he spent. If that was the case, he obviously spent most of his life on holiday. And I think that perhaps in looking through this collection, we'll discover the real reason for why he took photographs and why he travelled so intensively. There's a print collection and a negative collection, and the two overlap, and we've just done some random sampling on these to try and understand more about how the collections are formed. In terms of the overlap, we think there's about an 85% overlap. But for Tony's collection, because the negatives and the prints are of such high quality, we're going to digitize both negatives and prints and then pick the best image from that. And also we're going to photograph negative wrappers. We're going to photograph every page in the day book. We're going to transcribe that, because I don't feel that digitization should ever be an editing mechanism.
If you have a lot of images, it's how do you make the choices? Because unless you have unlimited funds, more often than not, you will have to edit what you're going to digitize. And by doing that, you are imposing your view and your choice on someone else's work. The thing is, you don't digitize in order to conserve an archive. You digitize because in that way you can share the archive. You no longer have just certain countries that hold the heritage of humankind, by having an archive on the net. A poor university in Mozambique can have the same access as I can from my university in London. And not only that, but people who look at the history of their own country, or who want to find out about their family, or I think it's a great development. I just, as I said at the beginning, think that we have to be realistic, that what we're doing is we're sharing images.
Digitization gives you a platform on which we can start to make the collection more accessible. I mean, also there's a conservation aspect of these collections. The environmental conditions here are good, but they're not optimal, and so digitization in effect allows the collection to have a digital life that will go beyond the life of the paper original.
Many hours spent with Tom looking through those boxes of prints, and I was aware of Kersting's photography from that time onwards, but it became more significant for me a few years later, when I started working in the Middle East, traveling around Kurdistan as a photographer in the work that I'm doing now. Kersting's pictures were a great reference and inspiration for me. There are a lot of parallels with Kersting as he was photographing during the Second World War. So now, it being a time of conflict again in Iraq, I see my inspiration as being Kersting's documentation of the threatened architecture and archaeology, and spent time in Mosul, in Duhok, Ahmadiyya, Erbil, and photographed the architecture. He photographed several sites which have now been destroyed by Daesh.
the challenge for us is to take all of these locations and start to put them back together in time, and in a sense kind of create one large timeline of this man's life. We can reconstruct the travels fairly easily, although it's going to take a lot of time, because we have every negative, we have every print, they all have dates on the back, they have locations.
In these notes he's recorded, next to every negative number, he's recorded a note about the location, and these seem to be quite precise.
The prints, you'll see that they have crop marks on them, and they have lots of notes on the back about how he wanted the image to appear. And often they have a note on the back, and he will often go to quite, some of them simply will say something which, to our in our modern perspective, is perhaps a little bit of a broad brush description. He will write on the back, a typical Assyrian man. I mean, I don't know if there is such a thing. But other times he will actually write quite a long essay on the back of his images.
People have always thought, as long as you keep the images, that's what's worth a lot of money one day. But actually, unless you have the paperwork that goes with it, you don't know what you've got. So I would say that's something to be most aware of. Especially with documentary photography, it's vital that you are sure that the captions are correct, because obviously the biggest misinterpretation is a wrong caption.
I think he was very much aware of the transient nature and the fact that many of the places he photographed were potentially very vulnerable, and has been proven to be correct in the sense that many of the places Kersting photographed have now been destroyed. Many of the ethnic groups and religious groups that he was photographing back then have in the intervening years been persecuted. I also think he was much more than just a documentary photographer. I think what Kersting did that was so important and gives his work extra importance today was that he was very much documenting a culture, the oldest culture, certainly the oldest urban culture in the world.